Welcome back to Second Breakfast and our ongoing coverage of A Game of Thrones, bringing you the best thoughts and theories and literary analysis this side of Westeros.
Wow, what a great new intro.
Thank you. That
Look
was
at you.
That was right off the dome.
40 volumes in. I like it.
Exactly. I'm trying to have fun with this.
This is number 40, right?
Yes, it is.
I'm very excited. Can you believe 40?
No.
That's so many.
I know.
That's so many.
I know.
Crazy. Well, I'm excited to talk about this chapter. I don't know about you. I really loved this. And, you know, as we always say, it was only 6 pages and it has so much meaning. But truly, that's the case here. And it's always going to be the case. You know why? Because George is a really good writer. So I'm excited to talk about this.
He is. I was talking about this the other day with Tristan, actually, friend of the show and frequent co-host. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about efficiency in storytelling. And I feel like this chapter is sort of a masterclass in that sort of efficiency.
Yeah.
So what happens in these 6 measly pages?
Wow, look at that bounce pass. You're doing great today.
Thanks.
Yeah, let me give a recap of this chapter before we dive in. Quick spoiler reminder for everything in this chapter and beyond in the show and the books. So this is A Game of Thrones, Eddard number 10. So Ned is dreaming what he refers to as an old dream, but really it's just a memory. And it's the night before his sister Lyanna's death. He is outside of this tower with 6 of his buddies. It's Martin Cassell, Theo Wool, Ethan Glover, Mark Ricewell, Howland Reed, and Lord Dustin. And they're standing outside, and 3 of Prince Rhaegar's Kingsguard ride up to meet them. This is like right at the end of Robert's Rebellion, basically. And they sort of talk for a moment, and then a fight breaks out. And in the midst of this fight, we also hear Lyanna call out in the distance, and Ned says to her, "I promise." You know, the classic promise me Ned moment, as we all know of. He then wakes up, and Vayon Poole is there, and this is like Ned's, buddy. And we learn
his last surviving buddy in King's Landing.
He's got like 2 left, and Vayon's one of them. We learn that Ned has been asleep for 6 days and 7 nights. And Vayon says that Robert wants to speak to Ned as soon as Ned has woken up, which is now. But Ned is too weak to get out of bed and go see Robert, and so instead King Robert comes to visit Ned in his chambers with Cersei. And he's, of course, not happy about that, he being Ned. We learn that Jaime has fled the city after their fight in the square, basically. And everybody also knows that Catelyn still has Tyrion, captured, and so Cersei is furious. As they're talking, she keeps trying to interrupt. She's trying to get her words in, and Robert is getting angrier and angrier with her. And at one point, Cersei says that Robert isn't being harsh enough with Ned, and she says that Robert ought to be in skirts and Cersei should be in mail. And Robert does not like that, and he slaps her hard across the face, and it's not cool. And so she leaves. And so then we're left with Robert and Ned alone in the room. And Robert says, "Okay, enough of this. I'm going to go hunt tomorrow, and then tomorrow we're going to talk this out." Doesn't bode well. And then Ned says...
There's that narrative call.
Yeah, right. And Ned is like, "Well, you did banish me to Winterfell, and I'm no longer your hand of the king. Like, what do you mean?" And Robert says, "Oh, no, you're still my hand of the king, and you can't leave." And so Ned kind of feels like he has no choice. And Robert says that someone has to rule this damnable kingdom. And that's to relieve things.
Yeah, I like the way you set that up. I think that was a very good recap. For being 6 pages, there was a density and a fairly unique tone that was achieved here. But that sort of liminal space, that purgatory that we leave Ned in when he gets the pin thrown back at him. They do this beautifully in the show. And Robert says, "I forbid you to leave. And if you do, I'm going to make Jaime the hand."
Yes, that's right.
There's a sense of Ned being trapped. Obviously, when we last saw him and he was unconscious and being wheeled back into the Red Keep, and it seemed so foreboding, like he was being carried into Dracula's castle,
Right, like they're going to hold him down and poison him and stuff until he, can't do anything.
He's trapped. There's an imprisonment happening here, which means he's existing in this reflective kind of limbo space. And I want to start by talking about that, because I was left with a feeling I really haven't gotten in any of our chapter discussions of any of these fantasy books we've talked about. It was a melancholy mixed with dread. I don't know. It was more insidious and subtle than that. It was genuinely hard to shake for a while after I finished these pages, because it's this idea of more. It kind of pays off some of the conversations we've had about Fire and Blood over on the Patreon, some bonus episodes going through the source material for House of the Dragon. But seriously, because that is this rolling, ongoing history of the Targaryen dynasty, there's a sense that characters flit in and out of the narrative, that everyone has their curtain call and bow, and there's always someone waiting in the wings to fill that stage. There's this sense of history never ending, and you see all of these horrible cycles of incest and violence and murder and all these things that never end with the Targaryens. There is something, you're left feeling kind of trapped and imprisoned and hopeless when you're reading Fire and Blood. I mean, it's incredibly entertaining and dramatic, but there's a similar kind of sense of inescapable melancholy in Fire and Blood that I've been enjoying a lot, but I wasn't expecting it here. And with the on-the-ground characterization we get in A Song of Ice and Fire, I think it's that much more affecting.
Yeah, it feels a lot more potent and just more upsetting.
Yeah, because it's Ned considering what happens next. He's grappling with this concept of more, which when you're a father with a bunch of children, I'm sure that's usually exciting. You get to picture Robb growing up and becoming Lord of Winterfell, and the daughters growing up and getting, all the typical happy horse shit that he's thinking about for the next generation.
But here it's like not that anymore.
That
like
idea,
it's just more misery. It's more terrible things happening. He's like no longer in control. And we know, like, from having hindsight, but also just we can tell from some of the narrative tricks George is doing, that Ned has been not in control for a long time. But I think this is where he's really recognizing it.
Yeah.
I think this is a big turning point for him.
It's that idea of more is a constant. In the same way life can be the scariest or the most hopeful word in the language, It's more can be a tease or a promise or a threat. And now we're getting to that threat phase. But I think there's something else happening here. If we'd broken this chapter into 2 chapters, if it had just been 2 kind of 3-page little wedges between our other POVs, I would have been talking about a big distillation echo. But I think we kind of get that here within those 6 pages because they are 1 chapter.
Oh, okay.
So I wanted to sort of signpost that before I lay it out.
Okay.
Because I think there's something more happening here. I don't think it's just a point about cycles of history and violence. I think there's something more here. Ned meditating, basically, after this street fight with Jaime. And in this, milk of the poppy coma that we find him in at the beginning, that dream that he's going back to of that fight outside the tower, he's one of 2 survivors of that fight. And then he had to exist in that aftermath, in that reflective melancholy where his sister died. He had to fight all these guys that he seemed pretty close with. It was kind of begrudging. They happened to be on opposite sides of the war, but the conversation they had before the fighting wasn't overly personal or hateful.
No, there was like a real sadness and like resignation to the conversation. It wasn't like, hey, you, fuck you. It was like, well, I guess we got to do this now. Like it was kind of like just like sad and subdued. I don't know.
Right.
It was strange.
So that melancholy after horrible violence that's totally avoidable, Ned having this kind of compounding survivor's guilt, I think that's the distillation we're getting here.
I see.
Where he survives these battles. And what that means practically is that he gets to see what happens after the battle, where all of these other guys that die around him or he kills, they don't get to see what happens.
Oh, sure.
His friends and enemies, their experience ends there, lights out, computer in the toilet, they're done.
And they get to have like the heroic death, and he doesn't. He has to keep on living and keep experiencing that more that you're talking about.
Yes, and he gets that eerie sensation of seeing what happens next, seeing what happens after the credits roll in the movie. And now that situation's happening again, he's at such a different station in life. Yes, he's still the right-hand man to Robert Baratheon, but he's so much older. He's got the family. He's the hand of the king. He's not, he's in a totally different region than he would have been at that time.
Sure.
And you see him clocking those echoes and differences. Like he's moving past the particulars of either given situation. He's moving past himself. And this time when he wakes up after the horrible violence, he asks about his kids. Mm-hmm. He wouldn't have necessarily done that after the Trident, when he'd known Catelyn for 20 minutes. No. It's not the same station in life that he's in. But I think he's a bit smarter now. And I think
I would hope so.
Yeah. We've talked about this on and off throughout these Ned chapters. I think he kind of knows he's screwed now.
Yes, right.
But more than that, in that melancholy that he's sinking back into, compared to the other guys that died in the street fight, Jorah Cassell, all of his friends, compared to all the guys that died outside that tower so many years ago, Ned is seeing the afterlife for those guys. But he knows that there's no reason that he survived where they didn't. Ned is not some accomplished master swordsman. There aren't people whispering about his legend and capability on the battlefield.
No, it just kind of happened that he survived.
He just did survive.
Yeah.
So the more times that happens, I think the more you feel the kind of ghost passing over your grave. He's not just watching the funeral and watching what would come after his friend's death. He's kind of living through his own funeral.
I see.
Because he did survive this time, but he's still completely screwed. His fortunes have not changed.
Yeah, he's basically like effectively died, but he still has to be around to watch the aftermath.
That's beautifully said. He's effectively died. And I think comparing that to the way the dream is rendered, and I'll hand that off to you, but he's kind of become one of the ghosts that he's haunted by. They're described in these memories where it's a dream, but it's mainly a memory, where the image of a lot of these guys' faces have faded. You know, they don't have Instagram. He can't review the photos of his friends.
Yeah, it's been like 20 years. Yeah, he doesn't, or 15 years. Yeah.
So they're described as faceless and misty wraiths.
Yeah.
It's powerful, it's eerie, it's liminal, but that's exactly the position he's in now. If you're watching this on YouTube instead of listening to it as a podcast, the thumbnail has the phrase ghost stories on it.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is why. Because he's remembering ghost stories, but he's also doing the Barbossa thing of, you're in one. I think he's becoming one of those ghosts here. Do you buy that
Yes, totally. I think that's great. And I'm seeming to remember that in one of our recent episodes, discussions of a previous chapter, there's a reference. It's not a Ned chapter. It's either Bran or Catelyn or something, but there's like a reference to Ned about being like effectively like wasting away, or a ghost or something, like, or his soul being dead. Like, I feel like it was in the Bran chapter. Like, I'm seeming to remember that now. So I think I totally buy that. And I like this echoing connection that you're making between the dream and his current situation. Like, the other thing is that one of his friends in the dream, in the memory, is Jory Cassell's father. And of course, Jory Cassell is one of his men who died in this fight with Jaime, 6 days ago. So it's beautifully mirrored and very sad. And I totally buy that he's in this ghost-like, effectively dead state. I mean, I really think this is a major... Both of these moments are transition moments for Ned, and turning points in his life. When he's, when it's Lyanna dying, and that's when his sister has died, the war has ended, and he's inherited this secret Jon from his sister. And Robert's whole trajectory of his life changed because he's not going to marry Lyanna anymore. It means he has to marry Cersei, so that's how all that shit happens. So it's this really pivotal moment. It's also when Ned becomes a father to Jon, and then I know Robb is born just a few months later. So
I was thinking about this when I was reading it. Tell me if I'm the dumbest Game of Thrones fan, but since I've been thinking about this series for, I don't know, 10 years now.
10,
I
12
don't
years,
even know at this point.
Over 10 years, I think.
Robb is named after Robert, right?
I mean,
so
he
Ned's
must be.
firstborn son is named after Robert Baratheon?
It would be a really fucking strange coincidence if he wasn't.
I'm just saying, that even deepens that connection.
That'd be like if you had a kid and named it like Tristane. No relation to Tristan. Like, of course he's named after Robert.
But that does deepen the emotions and the ties there.
Yeah, sure. But yeah, it's like this turning point where he's becoming this father. It's this moment of like friendship for him and his best friend. And now things are so different again. So he is like, I think what's really happening with Ned is he's fully recognizing his lack of control. And I kind of want to go through the dream and everything else happening in this chapter to sort of unpack that and understand it. The dream, as you said, it's not really a dream. It's a memory, but it's presented as a dream. And I don't think that's insignificant. So I think it's fair for us to pick apart and kind of psychoanalyze the dream the way that we have every other dream in this entire book. There's not a ton to work with here, but it's more about the echoes, I think. So I like it. You're right that the when you talked about the faces fading away, I'll read you that quote. It says, Ned had known, he's talking about his friends, he had known their faces as well as he knew his own. But in the dream, they were only shadows, gray wraiths on horses made of mist. But what's interesting is that when you compare it to the way he describes Rhaegar's guys in the dream, they are not faded. They're very clear. It says these were no shadows. Their faces burned clear even now. So Ned's enemies are like very clear and in front of him, versus his friends have literally faded away. And the same thing is happening in the current timeline. All of his friends and allies and family men have either died, like literally in the street, or have been are like not with him and are fading away, and we haven't seen Arya or Sansa on the page in a long time. We learn that they went to visit Ned while he was sleeping, but he literally didn't see them. So his friends and allies are fading or dead or gone, but his enemies are right in front of him. We even see like Robert and Cersei come face to face with Ned in this chapter, and Cersei is of course an enemy, and Robert is effectively becoming an enemy. And so that's also another like twisted mess.
It was like that idea of going to the funeral to make sure the person's dead.
Yeah.
Like one of the first faces he sees being Cersei, who kind of threatens to kill him 3 different times in this chapter.
Exactly. And so it's like, and Ned says to himself that he feels helpless. It says he was being given no choice, it seemed, and he felt as helpless as a child, which is like such a terribly sad thing.
For a lord, too.
Yes. And even when, to talk more about Ned's family again, Alan, who is Ned's captain of the guard, or his new captain of the guard, because Jory's dead.
Alan of Hull?
Not that one. But Alan promises that he's going to keep Sansa and Arya safe, like in this conversation they have. But the guy says, I stake my life on that, on their safety. But in that like same paragraph, Ned is thinking about Jory and all of the other men who were killed. So the fact that Alan is staking his life on Sansa and Arya's safety, like the implication is that is just as like weak and fallible and fragile, that like he could also die at any moment. So if he's staking his life on their safety is not very guaranteed, because Ned's guys keep dying. And so it just makes things feel so like out of balance and insecure, and like they're all about to topple. And I think even Ned even recognizes that. He keeps saying things either to himself or in the narration. I fear this is only the beginning. This doesn't omen well. It doesn't bode well. Like he's just recognizing that things are falling apart very quickly and rapidly, and like in this escalating, exponentially, increasingly bad way.
It's snowballing.
Exactly. And so not only is the dream this like memory, it is this reflection of what's happening. And because even in the dream, he also has no control. In this memory, he has no control. It says that it was 7 against 3, yet only 2 had lived to ride away. Rhaegar had named that place the Tower of Joy, but for Ned, it was a bitter memory. So Ned has no control over the feeling of and the memory of this place. It's 7 against 3, and yet 2 of them die.
In the same way, when at that moment where he was fighting with Robert was, the best he'll ever be. He's got the huge helm, and he's winning the throne. Them sailing in for the first time into King's Landing would have been a victory. That would have been a celebratory place to be. That would have been like the gates of Camelot. And now it's this viper's nest.
Totally,
and all of those graces and courtesies feel sarcastic in the same way the Tower of Joy is almost a sarcastic reading name here.
Sure, yeah, I could see that. And even the tower thing, like you've got the Tower of Joy, and this scene in the current timeline takes place in the Tower of the Hand. There are all these connections and mirrorings and reflections and overlaps that I think heighten the sense of disempowerment and lack of control that Ned is experiencing in both of these timelines. And it makes it all just feel really bleak.
Yeah, it's Charlie Brown with the football.
Exactly. So like I think this is when he's truly recognizing that it's all he's totally screwed. He knows more bad shit is coming, like you said, but he knows that there's nothing he can do. And it's a truly like dark and miserable place for him to be. How
fun to read, though.
Right. And what's interesting is that one of the things I've been really preoccupied with in this book, especially in like the first, 10 or 15 chapters of this, I was talking a lot about the seen and unseen idea, like what you can see, seeing gives you power. And I noted to myself, it's so interesting that the fact that Ned can so clearly see what's happening, he can remember this past thing that happened, and he's trying to learn from it. He can see what's coming, and yet that is still not enough.
Right.
If anything, the fact that he can see what's happening just further emphasizes his lack of control. So it's this idea that everything we thought we knew was wrong. We thought that, seeing is power. It's like if you see and know and understand things, you have more power. That's all wrong, and that's why Ned loses. Everything that he thought was true, like all the principles he was living by, everything that he like based his life around, is just not true, or is no longer true, or no longer applies, or the rules are different here.
Or it isn't enough.
Yeah, none of it matters.
You're reminding me of the Littlefinger-Cersei exchange, which I believe is a creation of the show, where he says knowledge is power and she says power is power.
Yeah, uh-huh.
Because we've usually seen knowledge and this almost surreal supernatural access to forbidden knowledge the way we talk about Bran and the three-eyed raven, and seeing these truths.
He has the ultimate knowledge. He's omniscient, yeah. And so he's all-powerful.
Right, that almost feels like a cheat code for him, or the way Dany will occasionally have these visions. And I feel like her entire arc is incredibly prophetic. We talk about these Targaryen checkpoints. But Ned he has the most important bingo card in the whole book right now. He knows about all of these bastards and conspiracies and murders. And that knowledge is not making him any stronger. Yeah. It's making way more people want to kill him. And so far, they're winning.
And yes, and that's the other similarity I forgot to mention between these 2 points in his life, is that he's like keeping or harboring or working with or aware of these secrets. Jon being this secret, not bastard, but secret, unexpected child. And then, of course, Robert's bastards and the secret of Jaime and Cersei and all that. So Ned's holding on to secrets in both of these times. And in both scenarios, it doesn't help him. I mean, he's more successful with the secret with Lyanna's secret, because it's one person who loves and trusts him, and he loves and trusts her. And he's so far been able to keep it a secret to an extent, to his own detriment, because people think he has a bastard child. But with Robert's stuff, you can't keep that a secret. The very act of keeping it a secret, Ned feels is wrong. And so he wants to expose it. And that's, I think, what's getting him in trouble.
And he couldn't save Gendry in the same way that he could save and take care of Jon.
Sure, yeah.
Never mind the 1,000 other bastards.
Yeah, and all the poor women who have, given birth to those bastards, yeah.
And there are all these allusions to Cersei having some of them killed, both the mothers and the children. Yeah. So I'm sure that's starting to weigh on him too.
Right, and so it's just spiraling out, and it's like way beyond the scope of his control. Like the Jon secret is something he can keep contained and locked down, because the 3 people who know about Jon, two of them are dead. Lyanna and Rhaegar are both dead, and Ned's the only one. Jon doesn't know because he's not old enough. Right. Literally nobody else knows, and so he is able to keep it under wraps as best he can. But the stuff with Robert is way more complicated, and so I think that's the escalation of the old memory, of the old situation. It's that, but multiplied or expanded or increased or intensified. And so that's why it's falling apart.
You talked about this chapter, I think it was about 10 minutes ago, right before this point. You talked about it as a turning point.
Yeah.
I really like that phrase, because I was thinking about it as a breaking point. And I think this chapter is sort of the transition between turning and breaking.
I see,
and that's just Ned clocking how screwed he is, how that he doesn't have any other tools left on the utility belt to reach for in this situation. And I feel like for me, this 6-page chunk of this book epitomizes what I love about the George R. R. Martin version of fantasy, because it's hard to describe. It's not just about these electric, memorable plot moments. It's also about this really delicate type of characterization that you don't really get anywhere else. There's this reflection and melancholy and philosophy, but I think the first glimpse of that kind of Mount Rushmore George R. R. Martin moment was in one of the last Ned chapters, where he was in that council meeting and Robert was just barnstorming in about how he wanted to kill Dany.
Yeah.
And that felt like such a seeing the Wizard of Oz moment of kind of breaking that myth of Robert as this conqueror, as the guy who finally overthrew the Targaryens.
Yeah, this great king, this leader we can all get behind. Instead, he's just this tyrant asshole who wants to kill a child. Yeah.
And every time we even talk about Robert, because he's not on page that much.
No, he's really not. Yeah.
Every time he's mentioned, we chip away at that initial image.
Yeah.
To the point that he's like an ice sculpture now. There's nothing left. He's just a little swan in the corner.
And he knows it too, and that's why he's flailing so much.
Yeah. But
he knows he's not cut out for this.
It was that shock of going behind the curtain and seeing that the big Wizard of Oz face is just this guy pulling some levers.
Yeah.
Breaking down some of those legends and myths. And I think it's that feeling, that shock, and that reaction that is my favorite thing about the George R. R. Martin blend of fantasy. It's seeing the ugly side of medieval fantasy, seeing what you and I talk about, what we talked about with Tristan for 8 weeks for the House of the Dragon, of seeing the historical side of medieval fantasy, which is ugly. It's
I
that
see.
idea of lifting up the rock and seeing all the gross wriggling
Yeah.
stuff underneath.
The reality of what this world would actually, and in many ways was,
Right.
like, would be like, and was like.
Right.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So, I mean, we
it's
talked
not
ab-
just like beautiful. Sorry, it's not just beautiful knights, riding on horseback and swinging their
Exactly.
swords and saving ladies. It's like, oh, these terrible systems that really screw up a lot of people's lives, and most people do not do well under the feudal system, and women have it terrible, and it's not good.
And there's such a romance to a lot of that, especially the way our culture tends to romanticize that sort of medieval. I mean, correct me on all the terms I'm using wrong.
No,
but
you're
that sort of
you're
medieval
right.
era.
Yeah.
I'm reminded of how effective The Witcher was with a character like Dandelion, who was a singer, whose job it was to dramatize and embellish and romanticize all of these disgusting, bloody, awful acts that we saw.
Yes.
And seeing that conversion in real time exposed it as sort of a propaganda.
Yeah.
Right?
It was such a
It was
great way to
marketing.
frame his story. It was really cool. I loved that.
Right, so that was kind of that look behind the curtain, but there's something so devastating about the way George R. R. Martin does it. It's revealing all of these duels and heroics for being dishonorable. Even the way Ned remembers that fight outside the Tower of Joy of being 7-on-3. That's not quite
It's
an
not very
evenly
romantic.
matched- Like when you see the sweeping shots of battles in Lord of the Rings, it's always two roughly even-sized armies smashing into each other.
Yeah,
it's
sure.
not one that's more than twice as big as the other one.
Yeah.
There's this lack of narrativity or justice when you
Right.
get down to the meat of it.
Well, and even in that fight together, one of the things they talk about before the fight is Jaime, the Kingslayer, who represents this muddied messiness of that romanticism, because he's this member of this Kingsguard who have sworn this sacred oath to protect the king at all costs. But of course, Jaime broke that oath by killing the king. But the king was this tyrannical nightmare. And so that in itself is its own moral quandary, and identifies and points out the inaccuracy and impossibility of something like a sacred oath, of this
Right.
romanticized version of protecting the king, because not every king is good and perfect and deserving of that kind of protection. And so it's very complicated. And so that complication is what sets off the fight in the first place. So it's so messy and not this beautiful romantic, moment of victory or justice or heroicism.
And you can tell that Jaime Lannister's story a bunch of different ways. You could be sympathetic. You could condemn him for his actions. But there's not really a version of that story that is romantic.
No.
And clean. It doesn't fit into a ballad anymore.
No, it's never going to be, even regardless of your viewpoint, it's never going to feel quite right. You're like, well, that was a little shady, in whatever
Yeah.
direction you want to go.
And
Yeah.
the more we see of all of these characters, the more true that becomes. They
Yes.
all escape the archetype that they begin as.
Mm-hmm.
And as I was saying about Robert, I think that happens more and more every time he's even alluded to, when there's a whiff of Baratheon in the room. And here, of course, we get some of his most detestable actions that we're going to see before his death. And that is the domestic violence.
Yeah.
That is seeing what power and cruel, casual, unchallenged abuse of that power a king would have in a medieval setting. And no one bats an eye. Robert doesn't. I mean, if you think of in a modern context, if you've ever been at dinner with a couple and you can tell that they've just been arguing a little,
Right.
and there's that kind of static in the air, and you pull back and avert eye contact
Yep.
and try to just give them space to clean it up quick, and then you keep going with the meal. Robert doesn't blink before. I mean, the way it's described when he backhands Cersei, I don't have the quote exactly, but it really emphasizes the size differential between them.
Yeah.
And the power in, I mean, it almost feels like he's clubbing a seal.
Yeah, I mean, it's like he slaps her, but it's described it's like he punched her in the face,
Right.
and it leaves a mark on her. It's not good. It's not just like a little slap. It was bad.
But he doesn't hesitate to do that in front of a guy he's known his entire life.
Right.
In front of his best friend who named his firstborn son after him. There's
Who
nothing,
he also knows would never
Right.
approve of that or be okay with, and yet Ned doesn't do or
but
say anything.
that's the thing. He knows that Ned's not going to challenge him either.
right.
On that. There's this ugliness that is sort of inescapable. I mean, I guess Cersei escapes it in that moment, but do you know what I mean? Robert's action there also makes Ned look like shit.
Yeah.
And I think we start to tear away at that sort of heroic, I mean, the beautiful casting of taking Sean Bean from Lord of the Rings into Game of Thrones. These are the moments where you remember, oh, this guy's really not Boromir, is he?
Yeah.
Who had his faults, but not really at this level.
Right.
And it's not just the domestic violence, it's the sexual violence that's implicit in a lot of this too.
Yeah.
The discussion of Robert's bastard, the one that Ned has just gone to visit in the brothel with Littlefinger, that the mother is 15 years old.
Yeah.
No one bats an eye at that either.
Nope, not cool. Yeah.
But it does more to shatter that reputation. Any sort of romantic vision of a king and a conqueror and a liberator and, the stag horns on his big helmet.
Right. And I feel like Robert even says, like, what do you expect? Every king has bastards.
Right.
Like, or something like that. Like, he says it like it's nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Like, why is this even an issue? What are you talking about? Like, of course I have bastards. It's pretty horrible.
It's as blasé as the way he talks about the hit on Daenerys Targaryen.
Yeah.
Where, of course, murder is a valid political strategy.
Yeah, like, what are you going to do?
And he brings that up again with almost this impatience of like, oh, we have to go through this again.
You want to talk about this again?
Right.
Like it's boring. Yeah.
And I think that lends, that kind of transitions into the largest topic that is being demystified. And it's death as a whole. And it's how often and easy we deal in death in worlds like this. It doesn't matter if it's in street skirmishes, all of Ned's guys who just got marked because of a squabble with Jaime in the street, or incredibly seasoned warriors outside the Tower of Joy, or just Ned going through a medical procedure of his leg getting fucked up and him being out of it for 6 days. When all you have is one crazy old man giving you whatever the hell milk of the poppy is.
It's just opium.
But what do you think the casualty rate is for any sort of surgery or medical event in this time?
No way is it good, yeah.
So there's a different relationship with death here. And I think the deaths pile up in this chapter and in Ned's subconscious. You have all but 2 of the guys from the fight at the Tower of Joy. You have all of Ned's guard, all of the friends and protectors and bannermen that he brought from Winterfell. And of course you have everyone else who's name-checked in that dream, whether it's his sister Lyanna or Rhaegar or King Aerys or any generation of Cassel you care to name.
Yeah.
It's that all these people are dead. And I think it's part of that thing I talked about earlier with the survivor's guilt. I think it goes a little further than that, because it's Ned clocking that there is no guaranteed way that any of this wraps up. There are no heroes or villains. There is no ending to this story. My part will just wrap up in some brutal fashion. There's just a desperate scrabble. There's just a bunch of people with overlapping plots. You've got the survivors and the cockroach characters and the manipulators, people making all these moves and plays and twirling their mustaches in the same way that Cersei is talking about the overlap of the Jaime versus Ned fight and the Catelyn versus Tyrion fight. All there is a roll of the dice for whose overlapping plot is lucky in the moment with the circumstances, the way the dice is. Like, there's no... Even the best strategists can get outwitted by just luck. Right. Dumb luck or fate or circumstance.
And we even saw that in the last chapter with Tyrion, where he had this whole plan about, doing the trial by combat thing. And then the last minute, he was like, this may not work. Right. It might be totally fucked. And then just Bronn just happens to do it. But like it even with the smartest character in the room, things can still just go terribly wrong. I mean, even when like Catelyn's last chapter, when they're on the road, Tyrion's smart, Catelyn's smart. They've got this whole plan worked out, like both of them on either side. And then just like the random mountain freaks show up and try to kill them. Like it's just random. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, the heroism of your purpose. None of that matters.
No.
It's might makes right. It's whoever's in the room, whoever's going to challenge you. And ruling over all of this, we keep talking about the king's justice and the hand is supposed to dispense the king's justice. The king's a bag of shit, and we keep seeing that. He's this drunken, flailing, disinterested megalomaniac. So we're breaking down all of... I mean, we're just with like a fine-tooth comb. We're just like destroying all of these archetypes, all of these heroic, romantic, beautiful symbols of this medieval fantasy era, but it's so engaging, the destruction. It is that House of Cards moment of seeing it all kind of fall apart. And I think that's part of what Ned's clocking.
I was going to say, he's recognizing all of this for the first time.
Yeah.
That's what's so significant about this moment. Because it's been happening, but he has not fully recognized it, I think,
he's
until
outdated. Ned's way of seeing things, Ned's way of, well, the man who passes the sentence must swing the sword, and we'll try to always do what's right and take care. Of course, that's not a survivable position.
Right.
Either.
And he's never been a like flowery, romanticized, rose-colored glasses guy either. His house words are winter is coming. They like recognize the grim realities of the world that they live in. But I think it's not about like how nice things are, but it's more about his worldview had been more about like what is deserving of success or praise or glory. And I think he's recognizing that doesn't matter either. Like, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how hard you work. The American dream is not viable in Westeros. I think he's sort of recognizing that.
He's one of those ghosts. The principled people don't seem to win in this world.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting to have him on the sidelines. I don't know exactly how many chapters we're going to have left of Ned.
Yeah, I don't know either. I haven't looked ahead. I mean, kind of just taking it as it comes. I'm enjoying that.
We're more than halfway through the book now. Mm-hmm. And I know he dies towards the end, but not at the very end.
Right.
You've got to set up Clash of Kings
but we've
a little
still
bit.
got a good amount of book left. So,
I know.
Well, I know he's got to get put in the dungeon at some point. I don't remember when or how or why that happens.
Yeah, Varys has to swoop in.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so things have to continue. But
I like looking at the rest of these chapters as sort of a living afterlife for Ned.
Ugh.
I want to view him as one of these wraiths or ghost characters.
Yeah, I think that'll be a fun lens or an interesting lens through which to look.
Something to keep an eye on. If you're reading along or if you have read or seen the show, what do you think of this particular moment in Ned Stark's life? Do you buy these theories, these ideas that we've trotted out in this episode? What's your read on this chapter? Thank you very much for listening and supporting the show on Patreon, getting all the bonus episodes we're doing over there. We're still right now putting together the final Fire and Blood episode. I believe that will be coming out this Sunday. That'll be available on Patreon, Volume 12, which covers the first half of the book. We went chapter by chapter through the second half, starting where House of the Dragon begins, but we figured, hey, I'd like to know where the hell we got here.
The way that we went about it, it was not planned to be that way, but it ended being
Things
that
happen.
way.
Things happen.
We went with what was going on. We just went with our gut. It was fun. It was
And
good.
if you like our ongoing fantasy sort of discussions, we've been talking about Diablo 4 for the better part of a year and a half now.
That's right,
We
yeah.
went act by act through the campaign, and then we've talked about all of the subsequent seasons. And our episode discussing Season 5, what is it?
the
Infernal
Hordes. Yeah.
It's a very metal season title.
It is.
That episode will be coming out on Tuesday.
Yes,
So
yeah.
It'll have our gameplay running in the background on YouTube, so that's probably the best place to watch those sort of episodes. Thank you very much for joining us for the discussion. Let us know what you think down in the comments or over on Patreon, and we will see you in just a few days with another brand new episode.